I was going to take a break from Shogun Showdown, maybe work on Divine Dream more, maybe on my playlist shuffler which still hasn't fully recovered from changes in YouTube's API, maybe on an avatar for videos. Either the old animated one, which I really like, but it is also really rough around the edges, and rather slow to animate, or my streaming zero-budget VTuber setup using VMagic Mirror, which would be perfect if the hand tracking worked better. But quite a lot of people on the Shogun Showdown Discord server have been asking about an update at the time. That, combined with the fact that an official one isn't happening, really motivated me to try and finish the content loader, so that I can give people the tools to make the updates themselves. And it also emboldened me to a point where I announced that on the server, alongside the deadline. So with no backing out, it was time to get things done. To begin with, I had to set up the tags, which was mostly a lot of busy work. The one thing worth bringing up is how I decided to store the tags, that is, in plaintext files. It was a decision made for the sake of future mod development, because imagine you wanted to add a new enchantment, with compatibility decided by a factor not covered by any of the existing tags. Being able to freely modify the tags of tiles from the vanilla game and other mods allows you to add a completely new tag for the sake of testing, without the need to change and recompile these mods. After also setting up tags for extras and Gambler package, I moved to implement the shaders, which might as well be black magic, and if not that, then at least malicious entities. I am only slightly exaggerating. I understand the idea behind shaders, and I can somewhat modify them, but I still don't know what half of the elements in them do, and the fact that regular shaders and universal render pipeline shaders are two different types, which work differently, have noticeably different syntax, because oh, what's that? You've been banging your head against the wall to try and make a simple overlay shader work as a modification of a URP lit sprite shader because that's what's attached to the icons in-game? Well, joke's on you. Turns out that shader doesn't actually work, because it doesn't have a normal map or a diffuse texture or something, so it's using a sprite default shader as a fallback. And sprite's default is, in fact, not a URP shader, so the code you just made with URP syntax will throw an error after error if you try to copy it over. All of that headache amounted to this: the ability to overlay a sprite at a specified location on top of the attack's image. Yay. And you know, it was fine. A simple, functional option that's good to have. But while you can slap a sticker on your sword and call it a fire katana, it's not the most impressive, nor the most faithful to the base game enchantments. And while there is no hope for getting unique sprites out of a shader, we should be able to get the thing that, though undeniably worse, is deemed good enough by the base game, and that is the palette swap. But while it's certainly possible, that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Because okay, we can take Dragon Punch and we just recolor the grays to the new palette. Same for Katana, Grappling Hook, Lightning, Spear. Simple enough. But what about Mon, or Earth Impale, Scar Strike? They don't have any of that grey. My first thought was to just replace the primary color set, but that idea already makes it impossible to use shaders, because they work pixel by pixel. They're not able to analyze the image to dynamically adjust to its color palette. That was an issue I went back and forth on and generally struggled with a lot, trying to figure out the precise algorithm that would give me the result at least somewhat similar to the mockups I made by hand. But since the general idea for it stayed consistent, and this devlog will be long enough without going into details, let's jump ahead in time to the first version that kind of worked. A script rather than a shader, which would analyze all pixels of an image, and create a palette consisting of all the colors that appear, except for black, sorted by how similar they are to one another. I then tried to adjust the script in a way that would make the entire selection of example tiles look good, which was ultimately a futile and time-consuming effort, as pretty much every idea I had to solve problems in one place caused new ones elsewhere. Whether it was using masks, comparing the replacement palette with ones extracted from the sprite, comparing the palettes between themselves to potentially merge them, merging palettes based on their pixel and color count, or even on their proximity in the image. I even briefly considered having the mod maker manually define the palette for each tile they add. There was one part of me that was telling me to just make the simplest version possible work and call it there, and another part that really wanted to figure this out. To find a solution that would make all the tiles look the way I want them to look. But writing image analysis and editing code isn't exactly my specialty, so I might have been missing something, or I might have been just wasting my time, and I just don't know which is true. I had to fight myself about it, but eventually decided that I should give up on this for now, because it isn't crucial to the mod's function. it's not even used for any individual mod's function. This compatibility is a bonus that I didn't have to include, so it doesn't need to be perfect. Besides, it's an open system. Perhaps someone else will figure out how to do it better. So for now, these are the results, and that will have to do. Though of course, finishing the script didn't mean being done with this. I still needed to make a base sprite changer class so that people can make their own scripts for their enchantments, and also include copies of all the vanilla tile sprites, because to run a sprite for a script like that, it needs to have read-write property toggles on, and it seems that the base game sprites don't, because the developer had no reason to do it, which was another batch of busy work. One thing that I did add to this script that actually worked out was different color selection modes. Since you don't know how many shades of the color to replace any given tile is going to have, you need to define a wider palette. At least for vanilla tiles and ones I made, a set of 6 colors works out well. But of course, if a tile doesn't use all 6 shades, you have to pick which ones it will use. The simple options are to take the dark shades, the light shades, or the middle ones. And these parts I added early on. I finished the script, prepared the vanilla sprites, and was generally ready to move on, but that one part of me just couldn't give up without trying one more fancy thing. That being a 4th color selection mode, brightness matching. If you want to see the exact code and description of the algorithm, I'll put it on the screen for a bit because I'm quite proud of it. But if you don't care about those technical details, you can probably figure out how it works from just the mode's name. Though one detail that is worth pointing out is that I had to add to it an exact match prevention, since there's no color that matches the brightness as well as the exact same color, and the point of this script is to make the sprites different. And then came that time of modding a new mechanic, where I have to scour the base game's code to check what I need to mess with to add more of the thing into the game. In this case it was enchantments, and as a test I initially wanted to implement the piercing enchantment I mentioned in the last devlog, but that stumped me for a good while because the code for vanilla tiles really isn't prepared for anything like that. A day later, after a while of bashing my head against that particular wall, I came to understand that isn't prepared is nowhere near the actual state of things. The thing is, the developer wasn't all that consistent in how different tiles work, or rather, there's only as much consistency as was needed for existing skills and enchantments. And that mostly boils down to all damage happening through a universal hit target function, but how a tile gets to that function, that depends on, I guess, how the dev felt at the time. And I can't even be mad at that because it's a very reasonable approach to take. It just makes my work harder now. And with the fact that I was halfway through my self-imposed time limit, and I still didn't have working enchantments looming over me, I decided to pass on the piercing enchantment for now and try to get the chaos ones to work. Starting with a unique tile background and a sprite altering script, both based on plasma noise, or at least that's what GIMP calls it, basically a multicolored fog. Immediately afterwards, my progress rate dropped way down, because first I was on a family trip, before which, anticipating spending several hours in a car, I finally figured out how to do game dev on my phone, which is something like 8 years old by now, and that heavily limits the options available. Though that whole thing is a topic for its own video. The point is, I couldn't do any work for a day, then on the next day I was feeling sick, and ended up mostly just implementing these plasma visuals into the Gambler package. That and writing out the steps that still needed to be taken for these enchantments to work. Next day I was fortunately feeling better, and started with the first step, getting the upgrades that could apply these enchantments to appear in runs. Eventually I figured out how to mod in stat upgrades and then enchantment ones to the post-fight rewards, with only a few minor issues along the way, and one stupid oversight, where I spent some time testing why one of the enchantments wasn't showing up, just to later realize that it was because the amount of cooldown it added made it incompatible with any of the tiles I had at the time. Then I had to do the same for upgrades that appear in shops, because despite looking the same, they are completely separate objects, which programmatically does make sense. One has reroll mechanics and is single use, the other can be used multiple times with an increasing coin cost. After that, it was time to plug in my two custom systems, the tags and the sprite modifiers, into the game, so that the new enchantments were functional and compatible with tiles from other mods. I started with tags and they were definitely the easier part, as graphics, not only I knew to begin with that there were going to be more work, because I had to implement separate handling of 5 different options of how a sprite can change, but I also ran into issues with the very first one of them, the one meant to put a sprite overlay on top of the default sprite. And then when I potentially fixed it and went to check, the game had the audacity to decide that my enchantment is invalid, and removed it from the tile. So that's a safety feature I wasn't aware of and had to modify, which wasn't easy because it was right in the middle of the tile generating function, meaning that I either had to replace that function entirely, or use a transpiler again to inject code into the function. But after the suffering I went through to get custom animations to work via transpiler, I wasn't all that interested in the latter option. So I did the former and replaced the function, and it still didn't work now for a reason that the shader didn't work with vanilla sprites. And I'm not sure why exactly, but my guess is that it was due to the fact that the vanilla sprites are on a sprite sheet, and the shader was trying to set the overlay position relative to the entire sprite sheet rather than the specific sprite. But whatever the case, the solution was forcing the game to use the versions of vanilla sprites I already had prepared for the sake of script-based sprite substitution. Implementing the palette swap option was much smoother, save for one case of freezing the game through an infinite loop, and after that, it was just a few iterations of test things expecting them to break so you know what still needs doing, before I had the enchantments implemented into the game, mostly. The enchantments themselves, as far as the game is concerned, have absolutely no special effects. It's the other game elements that can check if a tile has a specific enchantment, and if so, behave differently. For Chaos, I made an end of combat turn effect, which went through all the players' tiles and rerolled each one that was not queued up, enchanted with Chaos, end of cooldown. Rerolling itself copied most of the code from Warrior's Gamble, except it rerolled for one less upgrade than the original tile had, then manually set that last upgrade as one of the two variants of Chaos. And did that work? Of course not. Without a few more changes to the copied code, the tile effectively ceased to exist after being rerolled, remaining there visually, but becoming completely non-interactable and disappearing after saving and reloading. And after that, corrections were still needed. Tile upgrade slots were appearing after rerolling. Drunken Fist didn't want to cooperate with the sprite swapping because it had its own system for changing sprites. And because one of the upgrades you can reroll into is +1 upgrade slot, a Chaos tile was always bleeding tile upgrades. And that sucked, because this enchantment is at its most fun when it can randomly give you something like a free play 6 damage Tanerashima, and that requires it being a higher upgrade level. My solution to that issue was to make it so whenever the Chaos tile has more than 2 empty upgrade slots, on the next reroll one of them is going to be removed, and the random upgrade rolled one more time. Another thing I did was upgrade the appearance of Chaos attack sprites. You can see on the older screenshots I have that the saturation of the plasma noise was quite low in some cases, as it was mostly the same as the saturation of the pixels that were originally there. I changed it so that it checks the most saturated color out of the ones to replace, and if its saturation is lower than 80%, it increases the saturation of all colors by the difference between that one and 80%, resulting in a much more vibrant tile. Then there was a strange issue of the game letting me enchant an already enchanted tile. First time around I didn't even realize that happened until I noticed that I overwrote Chaos with ice on one of my tiles, but I am going to skip over that for the sake of time. Once the enchantments worked, I did one more thing, which is a bit of a spoiler, so I'll talk about it more near the end. And after that thing, well, I couldn't say in good conscience that the mod is finished. There were still numerous bugs I was aware of, some places lacking in polish, and a little bit more content that would fit right in, but I was running out of time and there was still one big task ahead of me. The archive, allowing for viewing and banning shops and upgrades. Implementing that began with drawing icons that different upgrade classes could use. It would be better to have unique icons for every upgrade, but I can add that later, and again, with the time pressure I was under, I was aiming for a minimal viable product. So then I figured out how the archive worked and added 2 new tabs, for now containing empty copies of the skills page. And while initially I did that just for testing, a day later I realized that I'm already modifying the skills page to let it display multiple subpages of skills, and it would probably be easy enough to make it possible to display non-skill images and descriptions too. Though easy turned out to be not the case, as to get the list of all the upgrades and their descriptions, I had to get the reference to the map instance through the map manager, then use access tools to get map's bamboo grove location field, then from this map location I had to get its location data, the data of the 4th sublocation of that, and finally the only room of that sublocation was a reward room, which holds the instances of all the upgrades. And that is the simplest way I found of accessing a list of all of them. Of course, then I had to deal with some issues that archive bans caused by thinking that these are skills being displayed and trying to figure out if they are banned or not, but ultimately I did get it to work. Then I stopped taking notes and lost track of when I did what, but eventually I had 2 tabs correctly displaying both vanilla and modded shops, and upgrades through custom icons, and all that was left to do was make banning work. The biggest issue there was correctly detecting what each archive entry represents. You might recall, if you've watched an earlier devlog, that in order to have that work for skills, I had to construct a list of all skills and then iterate through it with every single archive entry, comparing the sprite displayed with the skills sprite. Here things were a little easier because I controlled how the archive entries were being spawned. And while you can't directly add new variables to existing classes through patching, there are some variables that don't serve a purpose at the moment, like the name of the game object that the archive slot is attached to. So I used that to pass along the technical name of the shop, because it's easy to get a list of all of them, and the ID number of the upgrade respectively. And again, I forgot about taking notes, screenshots or recordings, but I got it to work, and then I also implemented a feedback system, using the game's quest completion notifications, so you actually know whether or not banning something failed because the mod is broken, or if there is a reason for it. And after the archive, the one final thing I wanted to do was add something new to extras, so that just like with previous updates to it, you had a reason to update it beyond technical changes. What I decided to go with was adding 3 new skills, 1 dancer, 1 combo and 1 guarding, since that would mean that all the shops get 3 skills each. Looking through the ideas I've written down, I settled on the following. For guarding, steady stance. You are considered heavy and thus cannot be forced to move. This has a variety of small benefits, effectively reduces the damage you take from enemy knockback attacks, messes with bosses that use mirror and origin of symmetry tiles, and protects you from self-inflicted knockback, making Tanegashima much better in the vast majority of cases, and Drunken Fist less versatile, but more reliable. Except I had to patch the game specifically so that Tanegashima would respect being immovable, because in the vanilla game it only checks if the target is movable, not the user. Even though I believe there is an edge case where a heavy elite enemy could copy Tanegashima using the copycat mirror. For Dancer, it was graceful recovery. The idea there was that whenever executing a tile would fail completely, indicated by it flashing red instead of being used, you turn around and try again. It's situational, but it does improve lightning, shadow dash, and most importantly smoke bomb, making it an even more reliable damage avoidance option. I considered making it so it also triggers if an attack misses completely, but that, much like the piercing enchantment I wanted to try making, is actually quite difficult to detect. And after writing this, while walking down the street, I thought of a way that should make detecting attacks missing easy. It turned out to make it easier, but also that detecting a tile's failure is rather difficult without reworking my current handling of the execute tile patch, and that is the one I'm using for injecting custom animations, and if you've seen my first extras devlog, you know how nightmarish it was to get it to work. So I'm going to accept some unintended results of a simplified implementation, and say that graceful recovery works whenever a damaging tile fails to deal damage. And for combo, 100 deaths, a skill meant to make other combo skills viable for boss fights. It makes it so once per turn, damaging the boss counts as a kill for the purpose of triggering combos. Meaning that you don't need the boss to summon 2 enemies for you to be able to trigger a combo skill, just 1 will do. And then, it was done. I compiled everything, cleaned out temporary files, threw together some screenshots, wrote minimalistic descriptions, and at 1:30 AM, finally finished this project. Kind of. Content Loader will still need a bunch of work to add the option to load other types of content, especially enemies and bosses. And of course the whole point of the Content Loader is to make it easier for everyone to add new things, so I have to make tutorials explaining how to do that. But this chapter is closed. There are links to download the mods in the description or in the pinned comment if you want to give them a try. And to end things for now, I want to thank Eiki and Apocalypse, who were a huge help in regards to making larger scale and animated graphics, and sharing ideas that ultimately saw use in the Gambler package. And also, huge thanks to the Rodbot. I may be the one trying to resurrect Shogun Showdown modding, but there wouldn't be anything to resurrect without the work he put in. And if you want to hear potentially spoilery thing I've also made, stick around a bit longer. If not, thanks for watching up to this point. Subscribe if you want to hear me ramble about game design or to see the modding tutorials when they're ready. If you have any comments or suggestions, share them here or in the Discord server. And until next time, farewell. For those who are sticking around, let's take a look at what else I managed to implement. And that would be the quest chain meant to lead to unlocking the merchant as a hero in camp. To begin with, the only quest shown to the player is Avid Player, achieved by buying out the gambling shop. Doing so will unlock the tagging skill, and the quest to Defeat the Shogun as ? Tagging initially costs a whole 45 coins, but when you win as merchant at least once, that cost is reduced to 15. And winning as the merchant unlocks the quest Profitable Venture, which requires you to win as the merchant while having 100 or more unspent coins. This quest is what finally unlocks Merchant in Camp and allows broken coins to appear at the Moonlit Port Shop. Before implementing these specifics, however, I had to actually adjust the quest modding system in Content Loader, as it is one of the aspects I haven't yet streamlined, and the way they were implemented in extras was a very awkward affair involving splitting off a shared library from the mod and putting that into the decompiled game so I could build the scripts in there. But when I was originally implementing custom upgrades, I realized that the technique I used for them, and originally for custom enemies, works perfectly for skills too. That is, expecting the mod to provide a function that when called, returns an instance of the element in question. This leaves the content mods with a lot of room to set that instance up however they want, including a variety of derived classes, both vanilla and modded. And with that simple change done and tested, I could get started on the quests. Implementing the first one was more tedious than it needed to be, because the game provided two different events I could use to detect when the shop was sold out, a purchase being made and leaving a room, except at the point when purchase made event is called, the item you bought isn't yet removed from the shop. And you can't just assume there's one less item, because the last thing the player bought might have been a shop reroll, making the shop distinctly not sold out. And you also can't easily make this check on a delay, because there's a risk of the player leaving the shop before it's called. And the room exit event just isn't called when leaving a shop for some reason, so I had to make my own one. And though I ran into some chaos enchantment bugs along the way, the quest itself worked. And the second one, to defeat the Shogun as the merchant, would be far easier to implement, as defeat the Shogun while X is a quest type I already made for extras. And Profitable Venture is the exact same one, but also checks if the player has 100 or more coins. One more thing I had to figure out before I could test the entire quest chain was how do I dynamically adjust a skill's price. That is not something that exists in the base game, and I ultimately achieved that by making a patch for the shop items, so that when each of them is created, it checks if they are a shop item for the tagging skill, and if they are, if the hired help quest was completed, adjusting the price if yes. All that was left to do was test it over the course of 3 runs, during which a number of bugs made themselves known, but ultimately I managed to mostly fix them, run the tests, confirm it worked, and moved on to making the archive work as previously mentioned. And with that we are done. Again, thanks for watching. If you're interested in the modding tutorials, either subscribe or join the Discord server, and until next time, farewell.